Good morning. Welcome to today's Atlantic Council event, U.S.-China Lessons from Ukraine, Fueling More Dangerous Taiwan Tensions. My name is Matthew Kranig, and I'm Vice President of the Atlantic Council and Senior Director of the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security. Russian President Vladimir Putin's violent reinvasion of Ukraine in February 2022 fundamentally altered the international security environment. Against the backdrop of protracted conflict in Ukraine, tensions between the United States and the People's Republic of China have also continued to rise. China's more aggressive foreign policy, military posturing over Taiwan have contributed to strained relations between Washington and Beijing. Given these dynamics, Secretary of State Blinken will be making a high-stakes visit to Beijing soon to limit the possibility of an escalation in U.S.-China relations. How Beijing, Washington, and Brussels interact moving forward will be influenced, at least in part, by what they are learning about the conflict in Ukraine and for deterrence, resilience, and much more. For this reason, the effects of the war in Ukraine will not be contained to the Euro-Atlantic area. China and the United States are watching the war closely, and the lessons they learn will shape U.S.-China contestations over Taiwan in the Indo-Pacific for years to come. Today's event will explore these lessons and serves as the official launch of the Atlantic Council's new report, U.S.-China Lessons from Ukraine, Fueling More Dangerous Taiwan Tensions, authored by non-resident senior fellows at the Atlantic Council, John Culver and Dr. Sarah Kirchberger. Held in partnership between the Atlantic Council's Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security and the Global China Hub, this event will preview the report's core findings, including insights that leaders in China, the U.S., and Europe are gleaning from Russia's war against Ukraine, and how the application of such lessons apply to a possible crisis over Taiwan. This report is made possible thanks to the support of the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs through a grant to study how China's rise is affecting the transatlantic relationship. Work such as this is central to the Scowcroft Center's mission of developing sustainable, nonpartisan strategies to address the most important security challenges facing the United States and its allies and partners. The Scowcroft Center also honors the legacy of General Brent Scowcroft and his legacy of his ethos of nonpartisan commitment to the cause of security, support for U.S. leadership and cooperation with allies and partners, and dedication to the mentorship of the next generation of leaders. The Scowcroft Center's Transatlantic Security Initiative, co-host for today's event, seeks to shape and influence the debate on the security challenges facing the North Atlantic Alliance and its key partners. The Global China Hub, another co-host of the event, devises allied solutions to the challenges posed by China's rise, including China's growing influence on countries, institutions, and democratic values, the global ramifications of political and economic change in Xi Jinping's China, and China's drive to dominate emerging technologies. In this spirit, we convene today's event not only to examine the lessons learned from Russia's war in Ukraine, but also to provide practical policy recommendations to decision makers in Washington, Taipei, and Brussels to preserve stability in the Indo-Pacific region. Thank you for joining us today. We invite virtual participants to join the conversation. There will be a time for questions after the panel discussion using the Ask AC platform. And we encourage you to interact with us on Twitter by following us at Atlantic Council and using our hashtags #StrongerWithAllies and #ACGlobalChina. With that, I would now like to turn the event over to our moderator. We're very fortunate today to have Jane Rickards, who currently serves as the Taiwan correspondent at The Economist, to serve as our moderator, and she will introduce today's speakers. So Jane, thank you for joining. Over to you.
Thank you, Vice President Kronig. As I said, I'm based in Taipei and I write for The Economist. And without further ado, I'd like to welcome our speakers. First is John Culver. He's a non-resident senior fellow with the Atlantic Council's Global China Hub and a former CIA senior intelligence officer with 35 years of experience analysing East Asia. His distinguishing career included being a recipient of the 2013 William Langer Award for extraordinary achievement in the CIA's analytic mission. No less distinguished is Dr. Sarah Kirchberger. She's a non-resident senior fellow with the Atlantic Council Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security. She serves as head of Asia-Pacific Strategy Security at the Institute for Security Policy at Keele University. She has many rich and diverse interests, and her current work includes Asia-Pacific maritime security and China's arms industries. Now, I'd like to remind the audience to submit questions through the Ask AC link that we've posted. And without further ado, I'd like to hand it over to John and Sarah.
Thanks, Jane. It's a pleasure to see you all here today, and especially it was great to get to work with Sarah over the course of crafting this paper. She made invaluable contributions and really expanded the scope to include a European dimension. I think the origins of this paper were a comment I made to AC China Hub Senior Director Dave Schulman last fall, that we should look at the intersection or collision of the lessons China and the US are drawing over the first year of the conflict and the implications for possible Taiwan scenarios. Thanks to the efforts of many, especially Sarah, I think we've succeeded well beyond my initial idea. I'm going to start with China, and then I'll discuss US framing assumptions and initial lessons, and then Sarah will go off from there and talk about European, and then our policy recommendations and conclusions. Turning to China, it appears to be following the strategic assumptions that date from Russia's invasion. First, the US is an adversarial, declining, but still powerful hegemon that will be antagonistic to China's rise for the foreseeable future, and which will seek to foment instability within China and hostility on its periphery. In Beijing's view, US antagonism to China is now structural and bipartisan. For the Chinese Communist Party, the relatively peaceful global and regional environment that prevailed in the late bipolar Cold War and the post-Cold War period is severely challenged, as Xi Jinping told President Joe Biden in their March 18th call. Economic growth and rising prosperity are still important to Beijing, but they're diminishing as sources of regime legitimacy as the Communist Party's security imperatives grow. Defense of the Communist Party system, fueled by nationalism, expanded party control, more active cooperation with Russia and other US adversaries such as Iran, is becoming more prominent. Xi Jinping made this explicit in his speech to China's National People's Congress on March 6th, when he said, Western countries led by the United States have implemented all-around containment, encirclement, and suppression of China, which has brought unprecedented severe challenges to our country's development. China's second key assumption a year ago, or now going on 15 months ago, is that Russia is China's primary strategic partner. This a status that was further elevated on the eve of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, when President Putin met Xi Jinping in Beijing and signed a joint statement on February 4th of that year. Throughout the war in Ukraine, China's leaders have reiterated their stance, most recently during visits to Moscow by Xi and by China's top foreign affairs official Wang Yi in early 2023. The two countries are unlikely to ever have a formal mutual defense treaty, but intensified cooperation in many spheres, including military coordination, intelligence sharing, energy and trade will continue and even accelerate. Russia is the junior partner in this bilateral relationship and arguably more junior today than it was 15 months ago. But Beijing has deep strategic interest in ensuring that Moscow and Putin personally remains a viable ally in blunting US power. Most importantly for Beijing, it has a strategic need to keep Russia from internal turmoil or international setbacks that could result in the rise of a regime that is hostile to China. One of the great gifts of stable and now close Russia-China relations is China has not had to worry about a 4,200 kilometer border and can focus its security dynamic and its interests southward and eastward. Even as Beijing modulates its public statements in support of Moscow, China's strategic assumptions from before the Ukraine invasion likely have not changed and may depend on the long-term outcome in Ukraine. That includes the prospect of an outcome that Vladimir Putin can claim as a Russian victory, in which Russia continues to hold territory and forecloses NATO's NATO or European Union integration. A third key assumption of the Chinese is that its leaders hope that the European Union can yet act as a Western counterweight to perceived US hostility to China. And Beijing has at times tweaked its approach when deemed necessary to try to stabilize its ties with Europe. The European Union initially lacked unanimity about following Washington's lead in Ukraine, or did so only slowly and with less intensity on hostile trade action and efforts to isolate China internationally prior to Russia's invasion. Subsequent events, including Xi's long-awaited April call with Ukrainian President Zelensky and other largely symbolic moves, mark a slight tactical rather than strategic shift, and they underscore Beijing's willingness to make adjustments to try to maintain favorable relations with Europe, given the value Chinese leaders place on the region as a counterbalance. However, China's refusal to condemn the war against Ukraine and its enabling stance toward Russia have galvanized worries, particularly in Eastern Europe, over the trustworthiness of the Chinese government. How the Chinese Communist Party and the People's Liberation Army ultimately digest strategic lessons from Russia's war on Ukraine will depend on that conflict's course, the longer-term effects of Western sanctions on Russia and the global economy, and myriad other aspects, including elections in the United States and in Taiwan next year. But one momentous strategic implication of Russia's invasion is clear to Xi and the Communist Party. For the first time since the end of the Cold War, the prospect of major power military conflict and even nuclear weapons use are again characteristics of the global order. Russia's gamble in Ukraine that it could quickly defeat a non-NATO European neighbor and secure its near abroad has so far failed. But US-led Western unity and imposition of sanctions against Moscow have the earmarks of a protracted conflict that could drive new instability. If Beijing concludes that this is a durable characteristic of geopolitics and great power competition in the 21st century, it could increase Chinese preparations for military conflict in Asia and with either the United States or its proxies. Now, turning to the United States, Washington has not reduced its attention on the strategic challenge posed by China, even while dealing with the Russian aggression in Ukraine. Indeed, US officials frequently group Moscow and Beijing together as different sides of the same authoritarian coin. In its national defense strategy released last year, the Biden administration focused on homeland defense challenges posed by Russia and China, rather than simply on military contingencies in the Indo-Pacific or Europe. This sends a strong message that the world is actively contested now, and that the US is not just preparing for a potential kinetic conflict, but is already engaged in an active operation to disadvantage China, tantamount to a new Cold War. Despite Russia's launching of the first war in the heart of Europe since World War II, China remains Washington's main strategic focus. The United States is likely to apply the following lessons from the Ukraine war as it prepares for a potential future conflict with China. First, public intelligence disclosures that Russia planned to invade Ukraine, which the US started issuing in November of 2021, is a major US success, despite failing to deter Russia or realize major pre-war alliance preparations for the attack. The credibility that Washington gained when Russia invaded in February helped drive the immediate post-invasion international reaction, which of course was the reverse of the 2003 Iraq WMD fiasco, and resulted in even more comprehensive sanctions that were threatened pre-invasion to deter Moscow. Senior US military and administration warnings of Beijing's 2027 plans echo US intelligence warnings about Ukraine, although without the same specificity and high confidence. Another key lesson Washington probably finds applicable to a Taiwan scenario is the importance of providing both conventional and non-conventional support, including intelligence sharing and equipment in the run-up to and during any conflict. However, it is far from clear how well Taiwan could be resupplied in the event of a blockade, or if it could be supplied at all. As an island nation, it has no cross-border sanctuaries for stockpiling and delivery of key military and civilian supplies. And while Russia has been restrained from striking NATO members on Ukraine's western and southern borders, US bilateral allies in the Pacific have no NATO-like structures for collective defense. A lesson the United States so far seems resistant to learn from Ukraine is that nuclear deterrence by the aggressor, Russia in the case of Ukraine, China, prospectively in the case of Taiwan, enables conventional war and blunts outside major power intervention. The United States and its allies and partners should assume that China would be at least as determined as Russia to wield its rapidly expanding nuclear-capable forces and space and counter-space and cyber capabilities to deter direct US intervention. China has stated numerous times that it would be prepared to declare a state of war today if it saw Taipei, Washington, or Tokyo violate the understandings that have preserved peace since at least 1979. At the same time, China itself is through its threatening actions, has been doing the most to upend the understandings that constituted the peaceful status quo in this Taiwan Strait, forcing Taiwan and other regional actors to reposition themselves. And with that, I'll turn it over to Sarah for her comments.
Yeah, thank you very much, John, for summarizing so much of our report, and many thanks to the Scowcroft Center and to the fantastic colleagues on this panel for doing us the honor of launching this report. I appreciate very much all your effort in helping us there. Yeah, John summed up basically our diagnosis of the situation. How China is looking at the Ukraine war likely, and how the US is looking at it. And I will now say a couple of words on what we find Europe taking away from the situation so far and what recommendations we have come up with. So looking at Europe, the problem is Europe is very diverse in terms of its different regional security cultures. There's really clusters of countries within Europe that look at the situation very differently. And one can broadly say that those countries that have their own experience being occupied by Russia at some point in their history, they have always warned of the danger of such a war, and they were not really surprised when it actually happened. Whereas countries that have never been occupied by Russia, or that are Russia-friendly in their outlook traditionally and trusting towards Russia, such as Austria, France, or Germany, they were really, really surprised. So that was a rude awakening for a lot of experts and even military officials in these countries. That's why the Germans have come up with the term Zeitenwende, change of the times, to describe the rude awakening, whereas the Eastern Europeans have said, what do you mean by awakening? You must have been asleep all the time not to see the trend. So there's the problem in Europe. To come up with a shared situational awareness in the face of such a threat is a challenge in itself. And this is just a very, very rough description. One can say overall that, however, China's behavior in this crisis has, I think, impacted Europe across the board in a very similar way. So China is mostly seen, I think, as a covert supporter of Russia. And this is due to the fact that China has refused categorically to condemn the war, even to name it a war, and has basically tried to paint it as a failure of NATO or as the responsibility of NATO. And this is not convincing to any Europeans. So depending on the individual country, there is actually a danger, depending on how China moves on going forward in its covert support, you could say, of this invasion, that China could lose Europe. But China can hardly afford to do so. So we are now witnessing increased efforts on the part of the Chinese government to reignite diplomacy towards Europe, but they do not seem to really understand how much of distrust has developed across the board within Europe. So we can see now effects in terms of Europeans becoming painfully aware of a couple of things they tended not to think about very much: the importance of conventional weapons in modern warfare, the problems of securing critical infrastructures, where many countries have trusted, for instance, Chinese suppliers also with some critical components for their digitalization strategies and so on. So a lot of thinking now goes into the worst case scenarios. What can we do in case China decides to move against Taiwan, like Russia moved against Ukraine? How can we still secure our own critical infrastructures? What impact will this have on our industries? And how can we shelter from the fallout? And also Europe has come, I think, across the board to a newfound appreciation of the military capabilities of the United States, without which Ukraine would have not really had a chance withstanding this assault. So that has become very painfully aware that any dreams of European strategic autonomy at this point, for lack of capability, are actually just pipe dreams for the time being. So this has been a realization and also an appreciation for the fact that despite its worries about war in the Western Pacific, the United States has not left Europe to its own devices. In fact, it has reinforced its presence in Europe and is one of the key, if not the key supplier of arms to Ukraine. So that is being seen in Europe, and the NATO accession of Finland and the planned NATO accession of Sweden, and at some point, hopefully also Ukraine, is also testament to this newfound appreciation for the indispensability, you could say, of the extended deterrence provided by the United States. So I think that is how Europe is looking at the situation. And now, of course, the worry in Europe is, okay, we were unprepared for the Ukraine war. We are even more unprepared, perhaps, for a Taiwan war. So wargaming and thinking of like what happens if the unthinkable becomes reality, how would this impact us, has really started in Europe. And looking at the situation at this point that we're now in, we have come up with a couple of recommendations for policymakers and the public in Europe that we think need to be digested. So the first one is the obvious one. How did deterrence fail in Ukraine, and why did it fail? What factors contributed to it? We think that lessons need to be drawn very, very quickly. For instance, signaling weakness before this aggression towards Russia by not reacting strongly against provocations. That may have been one factor. Hoping for the best, making oneself dependent and vulnerable, for instance, to the Russian energy exports, in particular in the case of Germany. That were all factors that sort of encouraged Russia to risk this, to give the green light. So we saw also a lot of overtures towards Russia in terms of, well, we call it self-deterrence in Europe, maybe also in the United States, in terms of signaling, we will not send soldiers, we will not do this, we will not do that. And this was probably an effort at being transparent and non-aggressive, but it may have sent, in some cases, the wrong message in terms of, we are not going to react, you can go ahead without risk. So this is maybe one of the things we need to look at more clearly. Then we need also to draw a second conclusion. The war isn't really going well for Russia. We do not know the final outcome, and that will decide a lot of things, of course. It will decide on the impact it has on China, how the outcome finally is. But no matter what, it may be already apparent to China that it's a very risky course to go into war like this. And this may reinforce the notion that China might prefer to go for non-kinetic attacks on Taiwan rather than the full, amphibious assault that's incredibly risky. They might go for something more like a strangling strategy of Taiwan, which could be harder to counter, ironically, because in such a blatant case of violation of the UN Charter, like Russia committed, it was easy to galvanize support for Ukraine. It was easy to come together as allies. Whereas in the case of non-kinetic attacks that are harder to define in these terms, it may be much more difficult to forge such a broad coalition of support. And it may be harder to think of effective ways of countering it. So we would recommend wargaming to definitely include these types of scenarios and particularly pay attention to them and how to counter such attacks. We also think information warfare and messaging is an important thing to look into, because Russia and China both have tried to signal, in particular to countries in the developing world that make up the majority of UN members, some narratives that we think should and could be countered. For instance, framing the Russian war as something like an anti-hegemonial war, or also framing China's potential aggression against Taiwan as something justified, something also anti-hegemonial. Whereas in reality, Russia is fighting for a former colony, for control over a former colony. And this should be made clearer to countries that have a colonial history of their own. So we think it could be helpful to point out China's own obligations towards Ukraine, actually, in its friendship and cooperation treaty that amount almost to a security guarantee that China owes Ukraine and is not honoring, in terms of pointing out how such pledges of support coming from China to smaller countries may not really be that valuable if they are not honored to use that also in the messaging. And then, of course, we would recommend for more intel sharing, as we have seen clearly, as John already mentioned, how successful that strategy has been. The United States, not just talking to the Five Eyes allies, but in general, sharing more intel, making the case that this is a valuable, helpful tool. And we do not think, this is another thing, we do not think that ideas of driving a wedge between Russia and China at this point in history are going to be particularly successful. We do not see it. So we would recommend against trying, but this does not mean not trying to engage with China diplomatically, because clearly in such a tense time as this, one needs to talk, one needs to have channels open. So it doesn't mean that one should not talk with them, but we should be aware that China on its part is going to try and drive wedges between the US and Europe. So this is something we need to keep in mind now that we see increased efforts of China to engage European countries diplomatically in a stronger way. A last point in our recommendations is towards the United States. Just as Europe has a newfound appreciation for the value of the military protection that the United States is offering its allies, on the other hand, understandable frustrations with European allies notwithstanding, we think that European allies do have value too. They can contribute to a deterrence posture, economically at the very least, but also in other ways, in their political support, in their messaging, and in the many, many ways they can exercise their soft power. So we think the United States should not go overboard with thinking that Europe is basically not of value in that scenario, but should think more creatively how to employ the resources that Europe has at its disposal and make use of that for upholding deterrence in the Western Pacific. So that's basically our basic recommendations, and we will be happy to go into detail and discuss with all of you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much to John and Sarah for such a fascinating and insightful presentations. I would now like to introduce the distinguished panel. First up is Valbona Zanelli. She's a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Europe Centre and a professor of national security studies at the George C. Marshall European Centre for Security Studies. She also serves as the chair of strategic engagements in the Department of Strategic Security Studies. What I found interesting is her involvement in a non-partisan NGO, the Transatlantic Leadership Network. She's part of their NATO task force, which is comprised of European and North American diplomats, military experts, and security analysts focused on NATO affairs. Okay, next up is Andrew Nien-Dzu Yang. And speaking from Taipei, I think everybody's heard of him. He's Secretary General of the Chinese Council of Advanced Policy Studies, and he's Oxford educated. But I think everyone remembers that he was a civilian who was first Deputy Defence Minister and then Defence Minister. And it's very rare in Taiwan for a civilian to take on that very high-level role. Finally, I would like to introduce our third distinguished panel member. That's Rear Admiral Mark Montgomery. He's the Senior Director of the Centre on Cyber and Technology Innovation and a Senior Fellow at the Foundation for Defence of Democracies. Before this, Mark was Policy Director for the Senate Armed Services Committee under the leadership of the late Senator John McCain, and completed 32 years as a nuclear-trained surface warfare officer in the US Navy, retiring as a Rear Admiral in 2017. So I would like to ask the panel a couple of, along with John and Sarah, a couple of general questions. Sarah mentioned that non-kinetic scenarios might become China's favoured option for subduing Taiwan. And speaking as someone who's covered Taiwan and China politics for a long time, this reminds me of the ancient Chinese war theorist Sun Tzu's maxim that to subdue the enemy without fighting is the acme of skill. You note that allies should wargame and prepare for such non-kinetic scenarios, as they may be more difficult to react to than a clear violation of the UN Charter, as the case of the Ukrainian war. My question is, can you give more substantial policy recommendations on how this could be achieved? Because from the perspective of Taipei, I think that is a more likely scenario compared with other scenarios. And would any of this involve sort of a reset of military thinking, either in the US or Europe? Thank you. So who would like to answer first? The panel or?
This is Mark. I'll take a whack at that, having done quite a bit of wargaming. Hey, look, I think it's reasonable to think about non-kinetic solutions. I mean, clearly, if Vladimir Putin rewound the clock 2 years, he was having a pretty successful run in non-kinetic gray zone operations against Ukraine, and he was doing a pretty admirable job of trying to undermine the credibility of the government, grab significant swaths of territory, monkeying around with the economic development and productivity of Ukraine. So, I mean, I think if he could rewind the clock, he might think about a non-kinetic approach to whatever goals he was looking for. So I think if we apply this to thinking about Taiwan, certainly I recognize that a lot that the militaries of the United States and Taiwan and any other regional ally like Japan or Australia that might want to be involved need to think about the worst case, the kinetic case. But it's absolutely appropriate to think about, prepare, and make yourself ready for a non-kinetic scenario. And certainly, to me, the most important element there is building the cyber resilience of Taiwan, but also those countries that are thinking about supporting Taiwan, because we noticed this in the Ukraine case. And when I worked with Senator McCain, the Ukrainians came to us in 2017 and asked for support to counter what had happened in 2014 and 2015 with electrical power grid attacks in the wintertime, 2015 and 2016. And McCain and others in the Congress sponsored about $50 million worth of targeted cyber resilience funding that made a significant difference, and it remediated a lot of the problems in their critical infrastructure, assessed weaknesses, and got there. Now, look, the United States doesn't need to help pay Taiwan's bill on this. Taiwan has the resources to do it, but the United States can work with Taiwan to assess the stability of the security and safety of their various critical infrastructures, particularly the electrical power grid, water systems, financial services, the transportation links, the critical infrastructures that could be attacked. So I think, and we can send over teams called Hunt Forward Operation Teams that sit side by side with their Taiwan counterparts using tools that we have or known attack techniques we developed. And we'll learn from each other in this, because the Taiwans have a lot of experience in this. And then just very quickly, I'd say separately, there's a counter disinformation element to this, which is about Chinese, kind of the rapacious Chinese behavior towards anyone else's elections. And I think Taiwan gets the lion's share of that attention from the Chinese. And so I think they have to be ready. There's just, I think, a very constant disinformation campaign emanating from China towards Taiwan and others in the region, certainly towards, vibrant democracies, of which Taiwan is one. And so I think if you can build your cyber resilience, which is both, your critical infrastructure and your ability to withstand disinformation, you'll be in a much better shape, whether it's a non-kinetic alone or non-kinetic as part of a broader kinetic scenario.
Thank you very much, Mark, for your answer. I'm just very curious from Dr. Yang in Taipei. What does Taiwan think is the best way to counter non-kinetic scenarios from China, for example, a blockade of Taiwan?
Well, thank you, Jane. And I'm really appreciate John Culver and Sarah Kirchberg remarks and suggestions. I think very valuable for us as well. Equally, I want to thank Admiral Montgomery, suggestions in terms of conducting the war gaming scenarios, particularly sharing the experiences with Taiwan in terms of cyber warfare and cyber protections, especially dealing with the protecting of the key infrastructures in Taiwan as well. I think those recommendations are very valuable for us. I just want to go back to the topic today. What is the lesson learned for Taiwan in terms of looking into the Russian-Ukraine war and accompanied by U.S.-China big power rivalries and competition, strategic competition as well. Certainly, first of all, the Russian invasion of the Ukraine is as a wake-up call for the general public in Taiwan. Certainly, we consider facing the Beijing's strategy and intention, and their rapidly build up military capabilities, and also they never give up the use force against Taiwan to achieve their unification objectives. The ongoing Russian invasion of Ukraine and Ukrainian resistance provide valuable lessons for the general public and the policymaker as well. So providing the opportunity for our governments and constituencies to ask questions. First of all, what would be the best ways to address our effective deterrence to prevent China to use force against Taiwan? That's number one. And number two, how to reinforce or to improve our self-defense and send a message to Beijing. I remember Sarah has mentioned about the signaling. I think that's very important. We have learned the lessons from the Russian-Ukraine war. Deterrent signaling is very important. So I think that is a very valuable suggestions and recommendation for us. So we are constantly improving our deterrence as well as self-defense. Send a message back to Beijing. You cannot use force against Taiwan because it not only create a tremendous disaster for both sides, but also Beijing will suffer as well. You can't get anything out of your use of force. You also mentioned about we have to conduct war gaming in terms of looking to a non-military side. For example, Beijing probably will adopt the options to strangling Taiwan. Actually, we are facing this kind of strangling tactics in terms of their coercion towards Taiwan, such as cyber attacks. Number one, Admiral has mentioned about that. And also, we are facing, military operations short of war, such as flying drones or flying fighter jets, and naval ships across the medium line and closing to Taiwan. That's a kind of a new normal, as far as we can see. So we have to, take the lessons. And I also urge both the United States and EU countries to pay attention to the fast developing coercion addressed by Beijing towards Taiwan, and encouraging experts or experienced people to develop joint corporations with our people, not only the uniform people, but also experts in civilian side, to address other options that learning from the Ukraine experiences, how to protect infrastructures. Because Taiwan is an island, we fully depending on the energy supply from outside. So that is the key issue for us. If China conducting blockade or quarantine, imposing on the Taiwan in the Taiwan Strait area, and energy supply will be fragile for us and cut off easily. So that is a very important issue for not only the general public, but also for the government as well. And that is part of the Beijing's tactical operations imposing on Taiwan, which is, we call it gray zone operations or influence operations. So we haven't talked about that yet, but I think we should develop so-called security common pictures from all sides, not only from the United States, but also from allies, partners, and friends. As you're probably fully aware, we are here to protect our democracy and freedom, and we are strongly, insisting status quo and no provocation towards Beijing. So I think we should make extra efforts, sending the message, joint efforts, not to change the status quo in Taiwan Strait area, because that will create a global disaster for everybody. I want to stop here and welcome any suggestions or advices. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Young. Well, actually, this leads me to my next question. I was wondering how Dr. Zanelli would respond to the idea of non-kinetic scenarios. What would be the European view on that? Is that a new concept, or as Mark suggested, had Putin been using grey zone operations on the Ukraine-Russian border for years? Anyway, Dr. Zanelli, I'd love to hear what you think.
Well, Jane, thank you very much for this panel. And I would like to really congratulate John and Sarah for the tremendous work that they have done. And thank you, the Atlantic Council, for gathering us. I think, I'll start with the questions. We have, a team of real experts here. So, my question will be, what will influence China's strategic calculus, and what should we do to shape it? And maybe in this perspective, it's important to see that perhaps to understand that we did not do enough when it comes to Russia, and where were we wrong, what was wrong, and what we can fix in the case of China. I mean, when it comes to Europe, we all know that Europe, it's quite divided, although we talk about unity, but China has a diversified strategy in Europe. And so we see divisions when it comes to China. And there's those, three terms: partner, competitor, and rival. We can see that in different places in Europe, we have different perspectives when it comes to China. So that is very important to bear in mind. But, I'd like to focus more on the retro and future strategic assessment also approach. So what did the West, primarily in the United States and Europe, do to facilitate China's rise? The fact that nothing is static, and now that the US more, but also some European countries are pushing back on China's unchecked behavior, because that is important. It's not just pushing back on China, but what China is doing in terms of unchecked behavior. What can we do to change this behavior? And we know that China's rise was facilitated by a number of what I will call strategic blunders, from the favorable status to the WTO to overall lack of reciprocity when it came to trade and also investment. Our Western naivete in allowing Chinese easy access to proprietary information as part of allowing, Western companies investment opportunities in China, mainly, delivering technologies to China. Our laxity in not holding the government, and here more the Communist Party, accountable for data mining, intellectual property via online theft. Allowing Chinese students practically unfettered access to participate in research institutions, which is pretty much common knowledge that this knowledge was being transferred back to mainland China. Or our slow response, especially here in Europe, when it comes to the world border diplomacy. And I can link more, list more things that I think I will call like strategic blunders of the West. And so I think these are the things that have shaped Chinese actions and reflexes over the years. So the question is, do the Chinese government, do they see a change in the international attitudes or conditions? Or has the Chinese Communist Party structure dampened this picture to the point that they're still in a retro mindset? That is the first important question I think that we need to answer. And we should not forget that most of the current leaders have advanced in government during a time when China has been allowed to do what they wanted, being unchecked and unchallenged. So looking at the, from the leadership perspective is important. And so the question is, will Chinese leadership in the Communist Party push forward to prove relevance, resulting in overconfidence, that is very risky for the West. And also, among the Chinese Communist Party leadership, resulting in much discussed self-fulfilling prophecy at the end of the day. And so just very recently, the Chinese prime minister, he is talking about extreme scenarios. And actually, it's really trying to dramatize foreign threats as a way to secure power in China. So our reconnaissance, I think, has to factor in Communist Party Chinese lessons learned from observing our responses also to other geopolitical events over the past several decades. I could bring here examples. Let's talk about what we could have done differently if it wasn't for 9/11 or other important geopolitical events. We know that Desert Storm, for example, woke the Chinese up and pretty much launched their military modernization. And we have, I think, for a long time underestimated their seriousness or underestimated their capabilities to arrive to a near pure competitor status as quickly as they did. So I think this retroassessment will be important in order to designing the policy going forward, and it will allow us to craft expectation management to better manage everything. And that responds, I think, to the policy recommendations when we talk about non-kinetic scenarios, that those are the most difficult ones also from the perspective of the West. And so the future engagement opportunities need to consider shaping strategies to block China's notion of inserting or establishing its idea in a new world order based on their rules. That is the most important thing. And not just the focus on the transatlantic economy. Sarah and John bring that up in their paper. We need to think more about the global south. It was brought also during the conversation today. So this is very important. While it can sound radical, and I know, being coming, from Europe, I know it could be viewed somehow radically in Europe, in the context of Europe, weaning itself of Russian oil or extracting lithium from old oil wells or developing new semiconductors fabrication centers. Anything will be possible if we plan and execute it with foresight. So in conclusion, why it's important to understand how we arrived at this point, it's also important to imagine the future scenarios and plan accordingly. Now, I just want to bring very quickly two important data when it comes to, the rhetoric that we see in China, but especially from President Xi Jinping, but also the facts on the ground. So I think we're looking more at a two-pronged strategy. On one, preparing for worsening tensions with the West, and that is the language, that is the rhetoric, but also on the other side, trying to get closer to companies because they need those foreign companies. And so that is, I think, also the strategy in Europe of dividing and conquering Europe. And that's why we don't have, I am afraid that even in the long term, we won't have a European unified strategy, which then the consequence will be that we might not have a transatlantic unified strategy when it comes to China. So although they're preparing for worsening tensions and trying to create, to have their internal, growth, 20% of all world exports are Chinese. It's the biggest export in the world. When it comes to foreign direct investment, 2 years ago, China was the biggest foreign investor with 19.6%, 20% of the foreign direct investment outward. So that makes it clear that the drivers of Chinese growth are exports and also foreign direct investment. And here we can mention all the different strategies such as Belt and Road and others in order to factor that in. So I think that these are very important points to look at. But then my final point will be going back to what Admiral Montgomery was saying, that the key word should be resilience, and not just cyber resilience, to be economic resilience, societal resilience, informational resilience. So that is all part of the hybrid threats. And I'll stop here, happy to dwell more further in these topics. Thank you.
Yeah, that was very interesting, Dr. Zanelli. Does anyone on the panel have any thoughts about her comments? In particular, there's an apparent contradiction that China's anti-Western nationalism is growing, but simultaneously, as Dr. Zanelli pointed out, its dependence on Western business foreign direct investment, exports to Western countries, is also still there. So China, Europe, you say that Europe faces a paradox because China's quite divisive, but China also faces a, you could throw it back at China and say, well, China also faces the same paradox, that it needs to make good connections with Western business, even as it gets more belligerent in its anti-Western rhetoric. So I just wonder,
if I may, just one quick point, just to tell more about Europe. So Chinese imports in Europe have doubled just in the last 10 years, going from 200 billion to 630 billion. Even in the last few years, since 2019, that the European Union has taken a more critical perspective when it comes to Chinese economic engagement, we have seen big increase of Chinese imports here. So trade isn't continuing. Foreign direct investment, although they slowed down for a couple of years, they are picking up again. And also what is most important, we need to look where those investments are going. And it's mainly in the development of new technologies, targeting small and medium enterprises. That is the most difficult also for screening opportunities, for screening mechanisms.
well, I was wondering whether any other members of the panel or our distinguished presenters have any comments about this, or shall I move on to my next question?
But this is Mark. I would just say quickly that there's no accounting for greed in the sense that and this is true in the United States as well. I mean, a lot. It is taking the willing suspension, of a lot of disbelief, to not see what happened in Hong Kong, to not see what happens in Western China, to not see how the Chinese, intellectual property theft. These are all clearly evident signs of their lack of commitment to transparent rules-based systems. Yet American and European investors are pulled in by the mystical promise of significant returns. And so we are going to have to struggle with this, that China, unlike the Soviet Union or in the 1980s, or unlike Russia in 2022, is a very enticing place for investment, and we'll struggle with that kind of duality, and how our national security and economic potential productivity kind of have divergent goals.
Right. Does anyone else have any thoughts, or shall I go to my next question?
Well,
Okay.
I wanted to, if I may, very quickly, I think it's an important point that Valbona made, that Europeans are having to look a little more closely into what is happening inside China in terms of what drives the behavior. Because in Russia's case, we can see it was this Putin's almost like kleptocratic mafia state that was basically driving the foreign policy, as Russia experts across, for instance, Germany have said for years. But our political leaders tended to ignore the fact, and also did not really react to the Gazprom networks that were stretching across Germany and other countries, trying to exert political pressure. So with China, we have different types of domestic political, factors and drivers, but there are some similarities in how this domestic situation drives the external behavior. And business people are not the best judges of that. They tend to look very narrowly into their own, segment of businesses, and they do not necessarily tend to take the state-driven behavior into account. So I think that's a very important point that Valbona made there, that we need to have better situational awareness. And we can see China trying to wean itself off of external dependencies, trying to close such, levers of influence to the outside, tries to drive basically also foreigners away. And the result is that we know less and less about what's really going on inside China, which is a problem.
Okay, well, a lot of questions are coming in from the audience, but just people...
I had one comment.
Sorry.
It's great we're going to focus on resilience, and especially in key industries and technology sectors and security. We have to be mindful. We're a bunch of Europeans and Americans, and we have Andrew here representing East Asia. The global South has a really very high stake in all of this. it's not talked about enough. The great real victims of the supply chain, especially food disruptions caused by Russia's invasion, fell most heavily in the Middle East and Africa. And the global South has really sat on the sidelines, even as kind of the global North or the Western alliances rallied around US leadership in Ukraine. China does not ignore the global South. And if the answer, if the prescription from the United States, its European and Asian allies, is to hard resilience and pull back from the trading system built up over globalization for 30 years. And we ignore the potential, dire poverty consequences for other parts of the world. We need to think about those secondary and kind of tertiary implications.
Yes, that seemed to me to be very important because I think people in the global South feel it very viscerally. They, if you come to them with some sort of clever rhetorical argument like China had an agreement of friendship with Ukraine, they broke it, that's not going to really impact them as much as it would, for example, I think if Western countries, I'd love to hear everyone's thoughts, but if Western countries could help the South sort of feel more confident in itself and help it enrich itself. Does anyone have any thoughts about that? Okay, I'll go into my next question. Taiwan's voters on January the 13th will elect a new president. There's a possibility that the Kuomintang, which formally subscribes to the idea that Taiwan is part of China, could get elected, or even Nien-Dzu, whose Taiwan's People's Party is more friendly than the current ruling DPP. How would a new government in Taiwan affect your findings and affect US-China strategic rivalry and European perceptions of that rivalry? So I'll hand it to the panel and John and Sarah.
Well, I think this is a very important question here. Everybody is paying attention to the political developments in Taiwan, particularly leading to the general election, January 13, early next year. But nowadays we have three parties put forward their presidential candidates. Currently, I think all the message on the table regarding how to protect Taiwan's autonomy, current sovereignty status as a Republic of China, and also at the same time pursuing, again, continuously freedom and democracy. I think this is the basic consensus among three major parties in Taiwan, including their potential presidential candidates, even though they are competing against each other. I think in terms of how to managing Taiwan's security and preventing the use of force, particularly from Beijing, essentially, I think Taiwan wants to continue proactively rally support, international support around the world, particularly from United States and US and Japan, Korea, partnership and allies in terms of regulating, rule-based behavior in the First Island chain, and including Taiwan Strait area. So I think all the potential candidates, political candidates from three major parties, will certainly supporting and strengthening this approach and continue to work very constructively with United States, because we share the same value, particularly with the US and Japan, Korea, and in the surrounding neighborhood. At the same time, we also taking the opportunity to expand our exchanges, cooperations, economically, culturally, socially, with other area, including Europe. I think transatlantic support for Taiwan is most important for the next government and for the people in Taiwan. So I think whoever gets reelected next year, early next year, I think this is the common sense, and it is also in the minds of the constituency in Taiwan as well.
Thank you, Dr. Young. Does anyone else have any thoughts about my question?
Yeah, I defer to Andrew. I would just add, in 2008, when the Kuomintang candidate Nien-Dzu won the presidency, China, had been a relatively successful and stable 4 years. It rapidly increased cross-strait economic engagement, travel, direct travel for the first time, major investment. 40% of Taiwan's trade is still dependent on mainland commerce. But they also learned that, if they had a theory that a Kuomintang presidency could accelerate prospects for reunification, some kind of political resolution, and in little cruder terms, if they had Taiwan by the wallet, its hearts and minds would follow. They found out that wasn't true. Now, what's different today and heading into Taiwan's election is, I think the Taiwan people are much more sensitive today to the prospect that war with China or war over Taiwan is real. For a long time, you'd go, if you visit Taiwan and talk to people of many political stripes, they tell you it's not going to happen. There's too much money involved. The Chinese are equally dependent on commerce. I think Ukraine and Russia's invasion hopefully has caused people to rethink that, because while I wouldn't say the chance of war is high, it's no longer close to zero, and even 10% is too high for the prospects of Taiwan, because in any crisis scenario, U.S. intervention, invasion, embargo, blockade, I don't know. I don't know who wins, but I know who loses, and it's Taiwan.
Thank you, John. Does anyone else have any thoughts about this? No, well, I'll go over to the floor, and I've got some questions from the audience, and I'm going to read them out. And there's no particular order here. I'm just reading the first question as it comes in. So this is the first question from a listener. What are some of the trade-offs between, as the report pointed out, China's preferred non-kinetic approach to occupy Taiwan and the familiar Chinese rhetoric of a lightning strike to retake Taiwan? Now, the questioner says they're anonymous. So I'll read the question again. What are some of the trade-offs between China's preferred non-kinetic approach to occupy Taiwan and the familiar Chinese rhetoric of a lightning strike to retake Taiwan?
Well, this is Mark. I'll try something on that. I think first of all, I don't believe that China is in a position to do a lightning strike right now. I still believe they're a number of years away. And in fact, and I know another Navy admiral said 2027. And I think, in hindsight, we all wish he would have put a comma at the end of that and said, but this date can be changed by actions we take, Taiwan takes, China takes, or others take. And lots of actions have changed. And I would say that numbers actually moved to the right a little bit. And I'm, good on Taiwan and us for taking some actions to do that. So I qualify it with that, and I don't think it's likely. But the advantage, if they did a lightning strike, is that it pressurizes the system in what our ability to support Taiwan is based on a rapid decision-making process that says we are taking action immediately in response to what we're observing. And so Taiwan has some limited amount of ability to defend itself at that point, we'll say 4 or 7 days. And the United States hasn't very aggressively pushed forces forward to engage before that period ends, after some kind of lodgment by the Chinese on Taiwan in the beginning of aggressive operations. Then Taiwan would not survive as the political state it is. But again, this is highly unlikely, but that time frame is really important. And the issue is, and we as a democracy are a well-known procrastinator. Our national security decision-making process is not speedy. And the only thing slower than one democracy trying to make a decision like this would be 2 or 3 democracies trying to make a decision like this. So, the lightning strike pressurizes our system, and I could easily see a number of administrations failing that test, to rapidly make a decision to commit U.S. troops for really, jaw-dropping likely casualty numbers for us. It is not the war games I play, even under the best of circumstances where allies participate, everybody's made the right decisions for the last 3 or 4 years. We still lose, between 5,000 and 10,000 Americans in a matter of weeks, which is as many as we lost in these long wars we just fought over 20 years. And the numbers are much higher if other things don't break our way. So what I'd say here is the lightning strike pressurizes our system in a way that a blockade or a persistent gray zone operation wouldn't, where we could make a coherent decision in long, boring, drawn out national security, deputies, principals meetings, and get to the right answer in a blockade or a gray zone response that we would never get to in this kind of rapid condition.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Mark. Does anyone else have some thoughts about that question?
Yeah, I wanted to add to it, actually. And I think the important point here is that the most high-risk scenario, this lightning strike, we must make sure that it's always seen in Beijing as incredibly risky. So that's one way in which these two theaters are actually interlinked, as we also argue in the report, because the outcome in Ukraine, if it really goes wrong, if it really goes bad for Russia, if Russia really suffers for this bad decision-making, ideally, if Putin politically at least would not survive it, that would drive home the message to Beijing that the risk is probably unacceptably high to the regime, because regime survival, as far as we can say, is always like the top priority on the agenda of Xi Jinping and the Communist Party in general. So if we can make sure that Ukraine has that outcome, that would be fantastic. But on the other hand, we as Western countries, I think, we tend to make one mistake mentally. We tend to expect the opponent to adhere to our script. And I think what shocked maybe Europeans almost as much, if not more, than the decision to go to war in the first place is the way in which this war was conducted, the incredibly brutal way of warfare that we've seen, these incredible crimes against humanity that have unfolded in Ukraine have been committed, the atrocities that have been committed by the Russian troops and the missile strikes from afar. So who says that China would adhere to the Geneva Convention and other rules of warfare when it decided to strike Taiwan? I would fully expect China also to be extremely brutal in case it went ever into that direction. And who says that they would not just shell Taipei and bomb it to rubble, right? So that would be the things to think about. And this is why I think it's one of the most important outcomes of our work and our report, to say this is an important thing for the transatlantic community to realize how these theaters are interlinked, as we say, because I witnessed frequently, I find self-defeating discussion going on in terms of Americans coming to Europe and telling Eastern Europeans in particular, we understand you're worried about Russia, but Russia is not really the problem. The real problem is China. And they say, yeah, that's kind of not convincing if you're sitting in Eastern Europe. And on the other hand, of course, Europeans telling the Americans, your fears of China's military are totally overblown. Let's talk about Russia. I understand how Americans are impatient hearing that. So rather than making this a competition of what is more problematic, why not realize that these two theaters are interlinked? What happens in one influences what happens in the other. And let's just divide the labor and make sure that we present as sort of a united deterrent posture rather than this bickering about what is the greater problem.
Right. Does anyone, thank you, Sarah.
Yeah, maybe Jane, I'll just chime in because I completely agree with Sarah. I think that, what the West needs, and in this case, the United West, the United States and European Union, is that we need a clear executable, strategy, and not one that reacts to the crisis. but one that shapes behavior. And I think this is why we are here. This is why, we have the recommendations from this paper, because I think, what we have seen in the past is that the Chinese Communist Party and the government members, they have not been used to being held accountable in the past, as also, Sarah said. So making clear what accountability looks like, I think it's very important. And I completely agree with Sarah that I think the illusion of the West is the mirror imaging. And we have been doing that for at least last 30 years in this, current wave of globalization. We have done that in terms of perspective of, economics with China. And then my other point, which is more a question and because I don't have the answer, is that in case that China attacks Taiwan, then what do we do? But what will Western imposed Chinese sanctions look like? Would we allow Taiwan's semiconductor companies to fall into China's hand? And how would we respond internationally from a Western coalition perspective? So I think these are very important questions, especially when it comes to sanctions, that we need to look more carefully.
Thank you, Dr. Zanelli. Yes, it's a very interesting question about TSMC and Taiwan's other star semiconductor companies falling into China hands, because you have to think about what would the highly paid staff do if they knew that China was about to attack, or if things were getting really awful. And there's a possibility that lots of them might choose to emigrate. So China could just find itself with some empty fabs, and whether it know what to do with them is sort of another question. But that's a very interesting point. Does anyone else have some thoughts about that?
I had a couple. One is, I really appreciated the comments by the panelists and by Sarah just now. I think the U.S., we have a tendency to view Taiwan crisis scenario as binary. It's either peace or war, and if it's war, it's going to be an invasion. And I think if you look at the history of China and its threatened use of force or use of force, it actually you could use military force for three different kinds of reasons, or to advance three different goals. The first is to punish, which is what they did against Vietnam in 1979 and what they did against India in 1962, and what I think they were prepared to do against Taiwan in 2008, depending on how that election went. The second is to compel a return to the status quo. And the Chinese think that that worked in the mid-90s, and think that it actually also worked even later than that, into the 2000s. That US ability to restrain Taiwan was their most important leverage by using the US-China relationship, which of course has deteriorated markedly now. So the third one is to compel. And there, the option to use non-kinetic means, and I agree a lot with Admiral Montgomery here, is if you try to launch a lightning strike, an invasion, a single roll of the dice, it can fail. Whereas it's very hard to decisively defeat a campaign of pressure, a campaign of limited use of force, gray zone operations, economic disruption, information operations. And remember, the Communist Party doesn't just have a switch that says peace, war, and if war, the PLA is unleashed. It's a regime that controls enormous number of rheostats that they can adjust to try and influence the outcome or the trajectory of crisis.
Right. Does anyone have any responses to that? Dr. Young, what are your thoughts?
I think I agree with all the comments. I think the idea that encouraging transatlantic consensus building in terms of in case China is trying to use force against Taiwan, I think we have to first thinking aloud to look into not just only the pure military operations against Taiwan, but also including other ways or means or tactics, simultaneously going along with the military operations to strangle or to force Taiwan to surrender or come to some kind of, towards Beijing's terms of political settlements. So that we should have to thinking aloud and develop a more intensive war scenario gaming. I think that's a kind of effort we should pursue in terms of bringing Europeans' ideas into the discussion of how to face the imminent Chinese taking over Taiwan in the near future.
Thank you, Dr. Young. Well, I think we've just got time for a few more questions. Someone who gives their name as Senge Sering, I hope I pronounced this right, has a question. How do you assess the approach of US partners in the Middle East if China attacks Taiwan? Do any of the presenters or the panelists like to respond to this? I'll repeat the question. How do you assess the approach of US partners in the Middle East if China attacks Taiwan?
I mean, I'll just say that, you know, I think that the non-directly affected countries like that are going to respond much like the global South has to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which is attempt their hardest to not be proven to be taking a position. And then you'll see some exploit economic advantage that comes from this, as we've seen in the case of Russia, where clearly a country like India, which has every reason to be concerned about, you know, inappropriate actions or aggressive actions by authoritarian states, has still, you know, lightly to completely to not condemn the Russian action, and has certainly exploited the sanctions process going on, European sanctions against oil and natural gas, to get themselves a better deal. I think the same thing will happen in the case of a Chinese and a U.S.-China confrontation over Taiwan. I think we'll find that countries that don't have to take a position won't, and the countries that can make money or find them in place themselves in a better economic position will take advantage of that.
Thanks, Rear Admiral Montgomery. Does anyone else have any thoughts about that question?
Jane, I just want to say that I agree with Admiral Montgomery. So I think they will be slow to take a position that will be pragmatic about their interests, because I think, you know, China's internal economic picture is not very good, and this amps up their dependence on global trade. So very much agree with Admiral Montgomery.
Okay.
And one thing, can I ask one other thing? But John made a great point earlier on that Taiwan would be in a real pickle economically, you know, would be suffering the most in this crisis. I'll just say the country that's going to be suffering the second most economically is China. China has significant economic ties into Taiwan, and even before any kind of sanctioning, China will suffer heavily in either a blockade or a cross-strait invasion scenario. And then if you add in sanctioning, will be suffering even harder. So I do want to say that there'll be a whiff of economic desperation about the Chinese outreach, you know, in the immediate aftermath of the start of one of these events. Sorry.
I fully agree with Edward McGowan's comments. Bringing Taiwan's cross-strait trade, China is also heavily dependent on Taiwan's export to mainland China. So they will immediately suffer if it should resort to the use of force against Taiwan.
I would just add, I'm not a soothsayer or an economist, which sometimes seem to be the same thing. Sanctions, you know, China is 10 times the economy that Russia is or was. The disruption caused by war with the United States, with China, I mean, it's going to be so huge that the sanctions will almost not matter. The war itself will be the sanctions. It will be tremendously disruptive. I don't disagree with Mark that China would suffer the most, and also is in, even today, not the best economic position. But you know, it's hard to overstate the economic consequences of sort of ultimate disaster here.
Right. Well, I think, thank you, John. I think this will be one of the final questions, but I have a question from someone called Carl Bushman of CSCMP. And his question is, how should those of us in the supply chain profession rethink our role in logistics, transport, and distribution? So I'll repeat that. How should those of us in the supply chain profession rethink our role in logistics, transport, and distribution? Does Does anyone want to jump in on that?
I'm going to wait for Mark to gird himself. I think there's a little too much heightened rhetoric about war in the near term, and I'm getting at queries to brief corporations who have no direct exposure to China or Taiwan, who have become worried that war is imminent. I don't think war is imminent, but it's good to pay attention to the indicators. I think what a lot of companies are doing and in the global supply chain is, if to the extent they can, they're finding ways to hedge their risk, to not sole source only from China. But I will also caution people not to freak out about Taiwan as a place to do business. It's still an excellent place to do business, even outside of the semiconductor supply chain, that it has a lot of capacity to manage its own risks. And I wouldn't be overly swayed by the dire predictions of war in the next 2 years.
If I may add to that, however, I have a feeling from talking with European industry people that businesses tend not to proactively look for particular, individual vulnerabilities in their supply chain unless they have enough pressure to feel that they need to do it. So I've been in talks with, for instance, people from the car industries that frankly admitted to me that we have no plan B. We are totally dependent on some things in the Chinese market or from the Chinese market, and we have no plan B. And we can see right now how European car makers are pressured in various ways, to the point that the European Union is thinking of using, could say, restrictions and trade war instruments of protecting these industries from the fallout of this problem. So leaving this to individual businesses is often a bit difficult, but it would, of course, be advisable for any business to just have a very clear idea of their own vulnerabilities, and ideally to diversify the risk and not become completely, easily knocked out by just one factor, regardless of the risk of war is imminent or not. I think that's prudent in any case, as we've seen also throughout the pandemic, where we were caught unawares by a big global problem that implicated the supply chain. So that would be prudent advice, and maybe governments should think a little bit about the incentive structure that they put out there, because some businesses may have the notion that no matter how much they screw up, they are too big to fail, and they might get support if things go wrong that is ultimately paid for by the taxpayer, whereas other companies do not have that recourse. So maybe governments need to think also a little bit harder how to put out the right types of incentive structures to make governments care for their own resilience a little bit more, and not look to big government to solve their entrepreneurial risk issues, you could say.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kirschberger. I'm getting messages here that I have to wrap up the question and answer session as soon as possible. So I'd like to thank John Culver and Sarah Kirschberger for their fascinating presentations. And I'd really like to thank the panelists, Valberna Zanelli, Dr. Andrew Nien-Dzu Yang, and Rear Admiral Mark Montgomery for their contributions. And I think we've had a very fruitful discussion, and I think everyone's going to take something away about how the Ukraine war is shaping our strategic perceptions of what to do about the cross-strait dilemma. So thank you everyone for participating, and have a lovely evening or morning.
Great discussion, great chair.
Great chair, yes.